Hello everyone, and minasama konbanwa. My name is Yuko Shimizu, the Executive Director of the Japan Foundation Toronto. Welcome to Parallel Worlds, Translating Colorful, the last of the special events celebrating the Japanese author Eto Mori and her classic book, Colorful. Earlier this fall, Eto Mori was one of the featured guests at the Toronto International Festival of Authors, and together with this, we also presented the animated feature film Colorful, adapted from her book, and directed by Kei Chihara. Part of that was a fascinating interview between Eto Mori and Canadian author Kerry Sakamoto. The talk we're about to start is part of the series Parallel Worlds, Translators Behind the Scenes, which puts a spotlight on translators connecting to the two different cultures, bringing not only the words of that parallel world into English, but also its thoughts, values, and viewpoints. In this series, we talk to translators from literary fiction, manga, genre fiction, and children's literature to tease out the challenges and thrills of bringing a wide variety of Japanese works to English readers. Moderating the talk between author Eto Mori and translator of Colorful, Jocelyne Allen, is the moderator Dr. Mimi Okabe. Mimi Okabe holds a PhD in comparative literature from the University of Alberta, where she teaches courses on Japanese language, translation, popular culture, and world literature. She's an award-winning instructor at the U of A and recently co-founded an online teaching and learning platform called Japanese for Nikkei. Mimi loves reading detective fiction and publishes works on transcultural adaptations of Sherlock Holmes. Interpretation for Eto Mori will be provided by Dr. Momo Kano-Podolsky. There will be a chance to ask questions at the end of the talk, so please be sure to add your questions in the chat. I also wanted to mention that we will be recording this talk so that those who are unable to make it can enjoy it later. Now I will pass on to Mimi. Hello, Mimi-san.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the lovely introduction. Welcome, everyone, to what I anticipate will be a very promising session. It is with pleasure that I introduce our speakers today. Eto Mori has been a literary star in Japan for over 30 years. She has won numerous major awards in Japan, including the Naoki Prize, one of Japan's most prestigious awards for popular fiction. Colorful has been translated into 7 languages and adapted into 3 films. Colorful is her first novel to be translated into English. She lives in Tokyo, Japan. Jocelyne Allen is a Japanese translator and interpreter and has translated hundreds of short stories, novels, and manga, including the Eisner Award-winning Frankenstein by Junji Ito, the critically acclaimed Our Dreams at Dusk by Yuki Kamatani, and Onward Towards Our Noble Deaths by Shigeru Mizuki. As an interpreter, she has worked with Japan's most celebrated authors and artists, including Sayaka Murata, Nagata Kabi, Kyoko Nakajima, and Asano Inio. Her translation of the classic novel Colorful by Eto Mori was released earlier this summer in July 2021. And as was mentioned, interpretation is provided by Dr. Momo Kano-Podolsky. So, for today's interview, I have prepared questions from my perspectives as a scholar of literature and cultural studies and as an instructor who has taught translation at the University of Alberta in the hope to facilitate a discussion that will enable us to engage in a critical analysis of Jocelyne Allen's translation of Eto Mori's Colorful through a close examination of selected excerpts and chapters. I also hope to explore the more practical aspects of the processes involved in a book translation project by putting the author and translator in dialogue. So I hope that the audience gains greater insight and appreciation for Jocelyne's translation, and I hope the behind-the-scenes discussions will also inspire aspiring translators to take up literary translation. So I'm super excited. So without further ado, let us begin. My first question is for both Eto and Jocelyn. Jocelyn, how did this project start for you? Were you familiar with Eto's works prior to translating Colorful? And Eto, how did you feel about getting your novel translated into English? What were you excited about, concerned about? What did you think about Jocelyn's translation?
じゃあ私から行きましょうかな。
Okay,
Yeah, so I'll because you said my name first, so I'll just start us out here. I was familiar with Mori's work. Like I had read some of her like shorter stories and things like that, but I hadn't read Colorful or like I wasn't reading all of her novels or anything. Although I have been reading them a lot since then. Yeah, my editor actually came to me because I've worked with Mori's Japanese publisher before, Bunge Shunju. I can never say that properly. And so when Counterpoint licensed Colorful, Bunge was like, maybe you should ask Jocelyn and see if she's interested in working on it. So my editor got in touch with me, and I was like, yeah, that sounds great. I've heard about the book. It's part of like, it's part of the cultural zeitgeist almost, right? Like it's like you said, it's been made into films. It's been adapted into all these genres. And I moved to Japan like I think the year or the year after the animated film came out. So it was something I was aware of, and I knew the story, and I knew how important this book was culturally. But I hadn't had a chance to really get into it until my editor came to me and was like, "Are you interested?" And I was. I read it and I thought, wow, this would be such a fun project to work on.
Okay.
私はカラフルが日本で出てから英語版が出るまでに20年以上かかってるので、まず最初にその英語版の、出版の話を聞いたときはすごく嬉しかったです。とにかく、興奮しました。はい。お願いします。
So first of all, I'd like to say that it's been 20 years since my book was published, and it waited 20 years for the English version to appear. So just simply, I was very excited when I was told that there was such a project coming, and yes, very, very excited about the prospect of having it translated into English.
翻訳家のジョサリンさんに関しては、もう本当に素晴らしい翻訳家さんだと聞いていたので、何の心配もありませんでした。ただ、カラフルの中に登場する、例えば、私立の単眼ですとか、縄文時代ですとか、日本独特のカルチャーの部分をどう訳されるのかなというところがすごく興味深かったです。
As for Jocelyn, I had heard very good things about her as a translator, so I had absolutely no concerns, no worries about that. The only thing that I might have had a little bit of questions about was how would certain cultural aspects of the book touches upon certain things such as the entrance exams into private schools and that kind of education system part of it, or the Jomon period. I was a little bit curious about how that would get translated into English.
実際に英語版を読ませていただいて、そのジョサリンさんがその訳しづらいはずのところをとても自然に、とても巧みに訳されていたことにまず感心しましたし、キャラクター同士の会話の間合いみたいなものがとても日本語版の会話の間合いが忠実に再現されていて、そこにも驚きました。そして何よりこのカラフルというストーリーは誠という男の子の一人称で語られてるんですけれども、本当にその原作の誠がいきなり英語を喋り出したような誠のエッセンスそのものをとてもそのジョサリンさんの英語に感じました。
And when I actually read the English translation, I was really surprised at how marvelously Jocelyn managed to translate it into English. Certain things such as when the characters have a dialogue with each other, there's a certain sort of a timing of, between the characters' dialogue, and that was really very well rendered, and I was really surprised by it. And the novel is written in the first person, and it's Makoto telling the story from his own perspective. But it almost seemed like my character Makoto started speaking English very, very naturally. And she really managed to capture the essence of the character of Makoto, and I was really, really impressed.
以上です。
Oh, that makes
Yeah.
me happy. 嬉しいです。
I also agree that, you know, Jocelyn really retained like the authenticity of the character of Makoto so well, with such great integrity, and just the character and the voice really, I think, was translated well. All right, so perhaps if I can move on to the next question. In teaching translation, you know, I stress the importance of having strong interpersonal skills, in addition to having linguistic and cultural competence in the source and target languages. In this case, it's Japanese and English, right? Because I argue that translation is not solely a solitary activity. So, what was the process of working with each other like? How often did you meet, if at all? Are there any memorable experiences? What aspects were vital for the author and the translator to communicate and understand before the translation process actually began?
Well, we didn't meet. I think I started working on the translation in the summer of. I was first contacted in the summer of 2019, I think it was. And so we did all the work of like preparing a sample for the editorial division at the publisher so they could see if they wanted to proceed with it. And then we got the green light for that. And so then we had to prepare a bunch of like grant things. So we didn't actually get to work on the translation until like winter of 2019. And then we all know what happened after that. Suddenly the world sort of shut down. And so if I had been normally, like I commute back and forth between Canada and Japan, like usually I'm Toronto and Tokyo. So in that situation, I probably would have been like, I'm in Tokyo, let's meet and discuss. But because I couldn't do that, I sort of just hacked away at it on my own. I don't think we met for the first time until the translation was basically finished. Right, Mori-san? 初めて会ったのはもう通訳が終わったところ。
そうです。終わってからですね。
うん
はい。本ができてからでしたよね。
そう。本はまだ出版されていなかったけど、
出てないけ
the
ど。
book wasn't out yet, but it was もうすぐ出る。It was going to come out soon.
なるほど。
そうですね。私も今まで翻訳家の方と合わせていただいたことってなくって、他の言語に出版される時もミーティングっていうのは多分日本のカルチャーとしてないのかもしれないんですよね。他の方たちどうしてるのかわからないんですけど、実際にその翻訳をお願いする前に、その翻訳家の方とお会いしたことって今まで一回もないので、気がつくと本が完成しているという感じです。
じゃん。
So yes, we didn't meet, and actually, I've actually never had the opportunity to meet any of my other translators for any other of the languages that my books have been translated into. So it's more like, so the book is done, and so here it is, and so I've never had the opportunity to meet them beforehand.
なので今回ジョサリンさんとお会いできてとっても幸せでした。特別な機会をいただけてよかったです。
So it's really a privilege and a very special opportunity for me to be able to meet Jocelyn, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Likewise, I'm absolutely. Usually, I don't get to meet authors either. Like a lot of my work is in manga, which is very different from literary publishing. So you can't meet the artist and talk to them. So this is also for me a really great chance to just be like, yay, I get to meet my author for once. 私もあんまり作家さんとお会いできなくて、今回も特別な体験だなと思います。
Okay, thank you. So then it seems like Jocelyn, you had like full control over the translation of the novel. Did Ito-san also have some input in the finalized product? And to what extent do editors play a role?
Oh, that's yeah. I mean, I do have like full control in that sense of like I'm not beholden, like I'm not getting comments the whole time I'm translating or anything like that. But I mean, I do have the source text, you know, this little pretty book here, and I really respect Mori's voice, and I want to bring it as accurately into English as I can. And so I was really fortunate this time in that my editor is actually a native Japanese speaker, bilingual English Japanese. So she is a huge fan of Colorful. Just she loves the book to death. She's read it a million times, I'm sure. Yukiko Tominaga at Counterpoint Press, and she went through my translation with a fine-tooth comb. Like she read both the English, my translation, and the original Japanese, basically side by side. And she came back to me with some really great feedback, like, you know, is this, can we change this? Like I got so many notes and so much feedback from Yuki, and it was an incredible experience. Like I've never been edited by a bilingual editor before, like someone who could go in and look at the translation and compare it so directly to the Japanese. So I think that I think her hand is huge in shaping the translation, and I really, it was very much a team effort. Like I mean, I did the translation and then we like shined her up all nice and pretty together.
Yeah, I think that's great to hear that there is a sense of like partnership and team effort, because those are like aspects that I try to stress whenever I teach the translation course, right? It's not like I said before, translation is not something that you do alone in an ivory tower, but it involves a team.
Especially when you're publishing like books, this kind of translation, you know, like, I mean, now, like, obviously we're doing things like this together. Mori-san and I have done a number of events to talk about the book and promote the book. And that's one aspect of like, you're not alone in this. This is a team, and the editor and everyone, like the marketing people, everyone at the publisher, they're all working with you to make the book happen and get out there in the world so that readers can fall in love with it.
Yeah. Just for a question for Mori-san, if I may ask. So did Mori-san, did you have any input in the final translated product?
インプット。
最後の、その翻訳が出来上がった時に、例えば編集の段階で、ちょっと例えばフィードバックを求められたりとか、そういったことはあったんでしょうか？
それはないですね。英語に限らず、すべての翻訳書に関して、私がその何か意見を述べるっていうことはないですね。はい。
Okay, thank you.
Well, in principle, yes, no. I mean, yes, no, no. I had no input or no feedback was asked of me, actually. And that's the case for any of the translations, not just for English.
Okay, thank you. All right, so perhaps we can move on to the next question. So, literary translation, I think, requires applying a different set of skills than translating pragmatic text, such as instructions, manuals, recipes, because it involves an understanding of the source text beyond its literal meaning. Perhaps literature, unlike a manual, allows the translator a little more wiggle room in conveying meaning, especially when it comes to the translation of onomatopoeia, idiomatic expressions, and other types of figurative language, which I would like to take up later. But before we examine the translated text in detail, I would like to ask a general question. Jocelyn, how was the process of translating Colorful different or similar to your other translated works? You were talking a little bit about manga, but so how was it maybe different from your manga translations? What did you enjoy about translating Colorful? Mori-san, Your book has been translated into 7 different languages. How do you feel about your work being translated into these different languages? Maybe if you can elaborate on the process of working with Jocelyn or Jocelyn's team, how was it different from other translators you worked with in terms of practicality, in terms of cultural experience?
じゃあ森さんどうぞ。
私からですか。
今回
今回わかりました。残念ながらこれまでカラフルって中国語ですとか韓国語ですとかタイ語ですとかスペイン語ですとか、7カ国語に翻訳されたり、あとカラフル以外の作品も主にアジアの言語に、翻訳されてきたんですけれども、残念ながら私がかろうじてなんとなく読めるのは英語だけなので、今まで翻訳出版された本は読めないんですね。もちろん本は受け止めてこう撫でたりするんですけれども、中身を読むことはできなかったので、そういう意味でちょっと今回のインギリッシュ版と比べるのは難しいです。お願いします。
So it's a little bit difficult to compare this English version with the other books that have appeared in different languages, because that is to say, my Colorful, as well as some of my other books, have been translated mainly into Asian languages. For example, Colorful has been translated into Chinese, Korean, okay, so Spanish as well, but mainly Asian languages. And the only language, foreign language that I can sort of read is English. So that is to say, I will receive the books that are translated into those different languages, and I will look at them and I will handle them with very much love, but I can't read them. And so this has been a little bit different with this English version, and so it's, for me, it's a little bit difficult to compare.
ですので今回の英語版、初めて外国語に訳された本を自分自身で読めたことと、またその役者の方に直接お目にかかったことオンラインですけれども、これはもう本当に私にとって特別の経験になりました。そしてまた今回の英語版が、出版される前に多くの方が事前にこの作品を読んでお言葉をたくさん寄せてくださいました。これは日本にはないカルチャーですので、とても温かい文化だなと思い、とても感激しました。
So, as I was saying, this is really the first time that I can actually read one of my translated works. And so it's been very, very special. Also being able to meet Jocelyn and online, obviously, but we have been able to meet. So this has been, on the whole, a very, very special experience. And also, I would like to say that a lot of people who have read the book in English have contacted me and told me a lot of their impressions and gave me a lot of feedback. And I was very, very touched by that. It doesn't really happen too much in Japan. So it's been a very, very special experience.
That's so good.
Yeah.
That makes me happy. As for what you were asking me about how the translating Colorful was different, I think, like I mentioned before, like literary publishing is pretty different from like manga and light novels, which are the majority of my work. And so the literary process is a lot longer. There's a much longer lead time, I guess. So like I mentioned, I started working on the book 2 years before it came out, which is, I've never worked on a manga that took 2 years to come out.
Okay.
Things happen much more quickly in manga and light novels. Sometimes, like depending on the company and things like that, there's longer and shorter lead times, but you're usually, I'm not working on a book for 2 years. Like that's just, I wouldn't be able to pay my rent, you know? So like in manga, that's just the world it is. So this was really such a treat to just be able to really like spend so much time with this book and just really dig into it and like breathe Makoto's air and just think about the translation in a level that I don't usually have the luxury of time for, and then to work with the whole publishing team which, like I said, I've never had an editor who's bilingual like that before. So I've never been able to get that kind of back and forth and that really detailed feedback, which was an incredible experience. And it definitely shaped my translation practice after that. Like I really learned a lot from working with Yuki. So yeah, it's been great. Like it's such, I want to translate all of Mori-san's work now.
I think you would be the best candidate for sure. What did you enjoy about translating Colorful? Was it the characters, the plot?
I think the thing I enjoyed most about I'm a translator and I'm a translation nerd, so of course I'm going to say this, but just the language. I think Mori-san has such a way with words. Like the book feels so direct and colloquial and really spoken at the reader in a way that's deceptively simple. You know, like there's not a lot of twisty sentences that are hard to parse or anything like that, but that makes it's hard to be that straightforward. You know, like Mori is so skilled at writing that way. Like she has this way of laying it out, and it seems so, you know, it's so, when you see someone do something so well and it looks effortless, but there's so much effort in it, it's like that. So to capture that sort of effortlessness in the English translation was a lot of fun for me. Like I really loved trying to work through these puzzles and find just the right way of phrasing it so it seemed equally effortless.
I think that's true. I think when I read, I will say this again later on, but when I read Mori-san's text, where I like laughed and cried, I laughed and cried in your translation. It's so wonderful. It really is like a masterpiece. So it's really well done. Is it okay if I move on to the next question?
Oh, sure.
All right. So in preparation for today, I decided to read a chapter of the Japanese source text first, followed by a reading of the chapter of the English translation. And what this method really highlighted for me was Jocelyne's careful attention to detail, cultural sensitivity, as well as linguistic and cultural mastery in bringing the story to life in the target language. I also found myself learning as I read your translation. So, for example, in chapter 4, following the scene where Makoto confronts his mother about her affair, he rushes outside where he is confronted by Pura Pura, right, who reprimands Makoto for his actions. And Makoto responds in Japanese, quote, this is on page 78 of the Japanese source text, Pura Pura no言うこともChinpun Kanpun de wake ga wakaranai. And I was reading this and I thought, how would one translate Chinpun Kanpun, right? Because it is a semantically complex term. And though it essentially means, someone who isn't making sense, there is more than one way to go about translating this expression. It also sounds funny, right? So I was very excited to read the translation and was pleasantly surprised with Jocelyne's translation, which reads, this is on page 64. Pura Pura might as well have been speaking Greek for all the sense he was making to me right now, end quote. So what's happening here is Chinpun Kanpun, right, has been translated to speaking Greek. And I thought, yes, of course, that expression makes sense. Why didn't I think of that? And there were many more examples like this throughout the novel and its translation, such as the word gikshaku on page 159 in the source text, which has been translated to all pear-shaped. So my question is for Jocelyne. What informs your translation decisions? What strategies do you take when translating idiomatic expressions or onomatopoeic ones? Do they pose a challenge for you? And for Ito, I guess I'm not sure if you will be able to answer this question, but if you have, or have you worked with translators who have expressed their challenges in translating specific Japanese words into the target language? We were talking earlier about private school and the Jomon Jidai. How did they manifest, appear in other languages? Are there certain Japanese words that didn't translate well in other translations of the book?
Should I translate that question, perhaps?
Sure. Yes, please. Thank you.
森さんへの質問なんですけれども、こちら、今、ちんぷんかんぷんだとか、ぎくしゃくの例を出して、ちょっと、ジョスリンへの質問をしたんですけれども、他の言語で、例えば、そういったちょっと日本語特有の言い回し、それがうまく、もしかしたら、翻訳されてないんじゃないかとか、あるいはその非常に翻訳者の方から、これすごく難しいんだけれどといったような、例えば、ちょっとコメントをもらったりだとか、もしかしたらうまく翻訳されてないんじゃないかっていったような、ケースが、もしもあれば、お話しいただきたいんですけれども。
先ほどお話ししたように、これまでの本に関しては、中国でも韓国語でも、本当にうまく、訳されていたとしても、どっか問題があったとしても、私自身は読めないので、わからないまま、になっているんですよね。で、今回のジョサリンさんの役に関しては、私自身は違和感を感じたところはなく、本当にこういう訳し方をしてくださるんだなと思いながら、なんでしょう。すごく私も勉強になりました。はい。で、私も実は英語を日本語に訳すような仕事をしているので、英語にもやっぱりとても訳しづらい表現があるんですね。特にジョークですとか。それは自分自身もすごく苦心しながら、どうすればいいんだろうって悩みながらやってるので、翻訳者の方が工夫を凝らしながらやってくださってるっていうのは、理解してるつもりです。はい。お願いします。
So, as I've already mentioned, the previously translated works are in languages that I cannot understand. I cannot read them, such as Chinese or Korean. So I wouldn't really know whether it's been properly translated. Maybe there were mistakes, but I wouldn't be able to tell you myself. So I just let it slide, basically. But as far as the Jocelyn's English translation, this is the first time I can actually read for myself. And I have to say, I had absolutely no places where I thought, a little bit of a question mark. No, none of that. And more to the point, I was pretty much impressed at how well it was translated. And a lot of the times I found myself really learning from her translations. And actually, I do a little bit of work translating certain works from English to Japanese myself. And I do find myself having difficulty translating sometimes some certain expressions from English to Japanese, such as jokes. Jokes are very, very difficult for me. And I do understand that translators have those challenges. And so I have a lot of sort of compassion towards them.
Yeah, like Mori-san just said, like jokes are the worst. They're so hard to translate. And yeah, in colorful, there's a lot of like you mentioned, there's a lot of onomatopoeia, there's a lot of idiomatic expressions because it is written from the perspective of a 14-year-old boy, right? So they're going to use that kind of natural language. And I take a pretty instinctive approach to this kind of thing. Like my attitude is always like it should read like it should read like it was written in English, so there shouldn't be any weird like would a person say that? But like my guiding question is, would an actual human being say these words? Or is that what a robot pretending to be a human being would say? Like, because sometimes you read translations and it's like a lot of, I'm not knocking translations here. I shouldn't say that. But a lot of really culturally specific things or idiomatic things, just something as simple as like itadakimasu, which you say before you eat in Japanese, but we don't say anything before we eat in most English households, So what would a person say in that situation? What is a normal average thing? Or what would this character say, if it's like I don't know, like a big tough guy who's trying to be tough and he's like, I like food, but I don't want to be nice about it. He'll be like, oh, whatever, thanks for the grub or something, like that's a terrible example because no one would say thanks for the grub either. But
No, I understand.
but, it's a matter of like being with the character and being in that situation and paralleling that to English, like what would an equivalent person in an equivalent situation who is an English speaker say? And I think that's where you can really dig into those idiomatic expressions and make it sound natural and yet faithful to the source, you know. So it's really, a lot of it is very, I guess, being empathetic in a way, like really getting into those minds and getting into the mind of the author, you know, like who is Mori-san? Why is she writing this book? Where is she coming from with it? What is she trying to say with it? All of that informs the end translation.
Yeah, I think that's a really great answer. You know, the importance of channeling and respecting the energy, the voice, the tone of the character, but keeping in mind the importance of cultural appropriateness, right, for the target audience. That's so true. All right. If it's okay, I do just want to focus a little bit more on Jocelyn's translation of culturally specific terms. So throughout the translation, I observed that some culturally specific terms, such as Rabu Hoteru in chapter 1 is translated as love hotel. Kotatsu in chapter 4 remains as kotatsu, and kappa to kappa monster in chapter 5. However, there are several other words such as tatami, karage, nikuman, enka, ryosai kenbo, and hanafuda that are translated through other means, like strategies of paraphrase, explanation, and or equivalence. So in my classroom, I have observed how students seriously contemplate whether to retain the Japanese word in their English translation or not. And so, Jocelyn, how do you approach the translation? You kind of already touched on this, of culturally specific terms, especially in a genre that doesn't allow for the use of like footnotes. So you don't have like the option to add a footnote and an explanation of what is a ryosai kenbo, for example. And you know, from an instructor point of view, what advice would you provide students?
Yeah, this is it's really hard, I think, and it's very much a case by case basis. I don't think you can't necessarily generalize. Like with a book like Colorful, which is so Japanese, you know, it's very much about. I mean, the themes that Mori is dealing with are universal, but the setting and the place, you know, like the Japanese high school system and the kind of houses they live in and the food they're eating, and it's very much Japanese daily life. And so I think you have more wiggle room with leaving those cultural terms kind of as is or glossing them, because readers are expecting it to be in Japan. So if people were suddenly eating, I don't know, fried chicken, like Kentucky Fried Chicken. Well, Kentucky Fried Chicken's in Japan too, but like, you know, if readers are, I personally give readers a lot of faith. I think that they know what they're doing. I think readers can understand a lot if you just give them the signposts, you know. So like with your example of kappa, you know, like, okay, if the kappa is just sitting alone in a sentence, a reader probably doesn't know what that is. But if you just tag on like a monster or a spirit or a mythical creature or whatever is appropriate for the situation, then the reader goes, oh, okay, it's some kind of monster. And the story's not about the kappa. It's just a moment in the story. So we don't really need to spend a lot of time being like, a kappa lives in a river and it likes to eat cucumbers. Like,
That's
you
true.
know, it doesn't really matter in that big picture sense. So you can just sort of give the reader a foothold and then keep going, because the story is about, you know, this kid and how his life is all messed up and he's trying to figure it out. But at some stuff it does need a bit more of a gloss or explanation. And so like all of the examples you gave are, you know, great. Tatami, it's like, but tatami, you can just tatami mats or the matting on the floor or something like that. Yeah, it's kind of a case by case situation, but I think that's, you're always thinking about like, who is the audience, what is the setting, what would readers accept, what is going to trip readers up, like, because the last thing you want to do is trip a reader up. Like, you don't want them to be like, what, and then have to stop and go back and reread it, unless they had to do that in the original, in the source material, you know.
Okay.
So I try and think of it from that perspective. Like for students, I think if you're learning translation, I think you need to really think about all these different perspectives. You know, you can't just be like, this is a foreign word, therefore I must change it. And it's like, maybe it can be foreign. Maybe we can just massage the text so it fits and it feels comfortable in English. But yeah, I think a lot of it is developed just through practice, and like practice yourself, like doing translations and coming across these things and figuring it out each time. And also by reading translations and seeing what other translators, how they handle these things. And, you know, I always say like translation is it's interpretation. Like I'm reading the text and then I'm reproducing the text. So it's going through the lens of me. Like whatever Mori-san intended, I am not Mori, I am only me. So I'm reading that text, I'm digesting it, I'm finding what it means to me, and then I'm putting that out there. So the tone, the style, the voice, all of that is my perspective on it. That's my understanding of it. And so every translator is going to translate a text differently. So if you're learning to translate, a great way to figure this out is just read a bunch of different translators and see what they do, you know?
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. And, you know, the advice of like understanding that, yeah, the story is not about that kappa, right? But understanding the larger universal themes that the story is addressing. If I may ask, Mori-san or Eto-san, what does pura pura mean something? Because why name the angel pura pura? It is very playful. It is lighthearted. And then follow up for Jocelyn, you know, why is pura pura transcribed to P-R-A-P-U-R-A, pra pura, instead of pura pura?
日本では特に目的もなしにうろつくことをプラプラするって言うんですけれども、特にそこから取ったわけでもないんですが、天使らしくない天使にしたかったんですよね。あまりこう重々しい名前ではなく、なんかプカプカとかフラフラとかヘラヘラとかも、なんかそういう天使らしくない響き、サウンドの天使にしたくて、いろいろこう、プラプラヘラヘラ書いた末にプラプラに決めました。あまり深い意味はありませんでした。お願いします。
Yes, so the name pura-pura, in Japanese, when you want to describe somebody who's wandering aimlessly, you do say he's pura-pura shiteru, or he's doing pura-pura. I'm actually not saying that that's exactly why I chose that name. I just went with the thought that I didn't want it to be a name that was angel-like, like characteristically, typically angel-like. But so I was playing with different sort of versions, pura pura, hera hera, and I was just trying to come up with something that wasn't typically angel, like a name. So, and then not too seriously thinking about it, I chose pura pura. That's pretty much it.
I love that. As for why we did pra pura, like P-R-A-P-U-R-A in English, it's pura pura is really hard for an English reader to read. Like how do you say that as an English reader? Like, and kind of what came to me is like the name Barbara. Do you know like how it's Bara?
Yeah.
And it felt like that's a thing that an English reader can read like comfortably while still maintaining the general sound. Because if you say pura pura, pra pura, they basically sound the same, but the PRA is a lot easier for an English reader to digest at a glance. And when I did the sample before it was even decided for sure whether Colorful was going to be published, I did the sample and I had a friend of mine just read it over for me to see like what she thought of the voice and tone, and she's like, this angel's name is really hard. Okay. I'm gonna have to massage the angel's name a bit. She kept tripping on it every time it came up. She's like, and I was like, okay, that's that's not a good way for this book to go. So I think it doesn't lose anything. It still has that silly sense of like not an angel sounding name at all. It has the rhythm to it as well. So I think it's just a bit easier on the English eye to not have that Pura.
Okay, that's really interesting. So you went through like a testing process with the names first.
I do that not all the time, but some names are just really, some Japanese names are difficult for English readers, and so you have to kind of do some creative spelling so that they sound the same, but they're easier for an English reader to read, because you don't want the character's name to be a big stumbling block, you know.
That's true. All right. I think I have time for maybe one more question until we take up questions from the audience, if that's okay. Let's move to maybe question 7. So Eto's Colorful is really rich with cultural references, symbolic meaning, and compelling imagery that Jocelyn has really seamlessly translated for an English-speaking audience. The pastoral landscape where Makoto and his father go for some father-son bonding, and the scene where Makoto becomes like absorbed in his sketchbook in chapter 10 remain very vivid in my mind. Eto or Mori-san, in writing these bucolic scenes, do you visit certain places for inspiration, or are they purely from the imagination? Jocelyn, what is the process of translating these scenes like for you? You are not only translating what the reader has to see and envision, but you're translating like feelings and perspective of the world described and experienced through Makoto. So how do you immerse yourself into that character?
風景を描くときに実際にその現地に行ってみる場合もあるんですけれども、このカラフルに関しては、実際この川に行ったり、山に行ったり、田園風景を見に行ったりっていうことはしませんでした。ただ、うちの周りに公園とかがあるので、こういう緑の自然のシーンを描くときは、なるべく散歩とかして、その緑を吸い込んで、緑を吸収してから描くようにはしてます。
So when I depict landscapes and scenery like that, I do sometimes go on site and try and be on location. But for this particular novel, it's not like I went to a certain creek with a river and all that. That didn't happen. But one thing I did was that where I live, there are some parks around. So I tried to take walks and sort of do something like I just would describe it as breathing in the greenery around me and take a breath with the greenery around me. So that's pretty much the only thing that I did. Yes.
As for when I'm translating, like actually oddly enough, like Mori-san, I often go to the places if I can. So like I translate one series of books that's set in Tokyo in Nakano and Koenji area. So I'll go to like the bus stop and look at it and be like, oh, this is the bus stop in the book. But I didn't do that for Colorful. So we're like in the same place here. I think because Mori's descriptions of those places are so vivid, and so all that breathing in the green, it works because those scenes are so vivid, and all of the descriptions, like the park at night when it's raining and there's the park bench, and that's just so like I can see it in my mind, and it's such a heavy darkness and the rain and it's cold and your umbrella is, like no spoilers, I won't tell anyone what happens there, but yeah, so I basically just try and breathe in Mori's original work.
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you so much. So how about I'll just do a little wrap up and then we'll move on to some of the questions in the chat. All right, so in pointing out the limitations of translation, theorist and literary critic Gio Bandes or George Brandes once stated, "Whatever is written for the whole world sacrifices strength and vigor for the sake of universal comprehensibility. It no longer carries the flavor of the soil." He said this in the late 1800s or mid 1800s, long time ago. I couldn't disagree more. After reading Jocelyn's translations of Eto's Colorful, where I laughed and cried reading Eto's work, I laughed and cried when reading Jocelyn's work. Jocelyn's translation is nuanced. She demonstrates deep awareness and an understanding and appreciation of Eto's lighthearted and accessible prose. She captures and conveys the feelings, voices, and perspectives of a very complex cast of characters depicted in the novel with precision and has preserved the flavor of the soil. I predict that Jocelyn's translation of Colorful will influence North American readers, especially the youth, and inspire positive change in readers outside of Japan. Furthermore, as a pedagogical tool, I believe that Colorful will provide students of Japanese to English translation with insightful lessons on best practices of translating literary prose. I would like to thank both Mori and Jocelyne Allen for this really fascinating and fun, memorable discussion on the behind-the-scenes process of translating a book, but as well as like a critical, in-depth examination of the process of translation itself. So let us now perhaps move on to the Q&A. All right. So if I may, I would like to ask the first question because I too had a question regarding the mother's relationship with Makoto. So question 1 is from Eclipse Soul. Oh, sorry, no, Musahikun 228. And this person asks, for Ito-san, how do you know how mother thinks and teenager thinks? I was heartbroken when Makoto dismissed his mother's letter. She put all of her heart into the letter, but it's so authentic, yet I think what this person might be trying to say is like his reaction to it might have been a bit shocking.
手紙についてですよね。
そうです、そうです。
はい
はい。で、特にその誠の反応ですかね。お母さんからもらった手紙をあまりにもその無下にしてしまうっていう辺です。
まず手紙に関してなんですけれども、私は母親の造形っていうのを日本の児童文学の典型を破るような気持ちで作りました。今はそうでもないかもしれないんですけれども、20年ぐらい前、私が作品を書いた頃って、児童文学の中に登場する母親はどこまでも母親という存在なんですね。父親はどこまでも父親という存在なんですね。彼らは父である前に母である前に一人の人間であるべきなんですけれども、そうではなくも父親、母親という役割として本の中に登場するというのが一般的でした。お願いします。
Yes, so I would like to start out by explaining that what I tried to do with the character of the mother in Colorful was that I was trying to really sort of break the mold of what mothers in Japanese children's literature appear as. It's really typical in Japanese children's literature that the mother or the father, for that matter, are always depicted as with their role in mind. They're always fathers, they're always mothers, and I wanted to convey the idea that before being a mother or before being a father, they are human beings, they are a person. But in Japanese children's literature, they were always confined to their roles.
で母親が書いた手紙には母親としての彼女だけではなく、一人の人として、女としての彼女の弱さがとても濃厚に表れていると思います。それをどう受け止めるかは、彼女をやっぱり母親として受け止めるのか、一人の人として受け止めるのかによって、手紙の受け止め方は変わってくると思うんですね。ただ、誠からすれば、やっぱり彼にとっての彼女は母親でしかなく、一人の女として受け止めることはできないわけなので、あれを受け止めた、読んだ誠のリアクションというのは、やっぱり彼がその母親という枠の中に彼女を押し込めておきたい、という思いの表れだと考えています。
So when Makoto's mother wrote that letter, she didn't write it just as his mother. She wrote it from the perspective of one woman, and she was showing a lot of vulnerability as a woman in that letter. So the way that somebody who reads that letter, how would they react to it? It depends on whether they realize that this is written from this perspective of a mother or a woman. Obviously, Makoto's reaction to the letter shows us that he was not really able to go beyond putting this woman into the framework of a mother, and he really could only see her as his mother. So I think that scene sort of provides us the proof that that's what's happening there.
And if I may, maybe just as a follow-up question for Jocelyn as well, because I had a question about the mother scene as well. How did you feel as you translated the mother's letter to Makoto, and Makoto's reaction to that letter? Do your opinions of certain characters influence that process of translation for you?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, when I was translating, I very much saw what Mori was doing with it, like framing, because Makoto's a boy, and I mean, he's 14, and at that age, you're not really recognizing your parents as people yet. So he's seeing all of his mother's actions as just, she's bad. She's a bad mom, and she shouldn't do these things because this isn't what moms do. Whereas Mori is really portraying her as a woman who has other aspects of herself besides being, Makoto's mom. And so, as the translator, and I think as the author as well, like you're seeing all of the perspectives, like that scene where Makoto reacts, that's written from Makoto's perspective. And so it has to, you have to really understand what is a 14-year-old boy feeling when he reads a letter like this from his mother. Imagine getting a letter like that from your mother at 14. There are very few of us who would react in a mature way to that, but at the same time, you read the letter, when you're reading the letter, it is the mother, and it is her, and it's her perspective. And so, I mean, translating that, I was like, I'm in the mother's head when I'm translating this letter. Like, the letter itself is purely, it's her voice. But then you come back out of that, and you're back with Makoto's voice because he's telling the story. And so I think in the original, there's that very fine balance between the mother's perspective and Makoto's perspective. And I hope that it's reflected in the translation as well, because I was trying to.
Yes, it is. All right, thank you for that. Maybe we will go on to the second question. This is for Ito-san. I thought this question is kind of interesting because if you consider, cinematic adaptations as a form of translation, if you will, perhaps it's important and interesting that way. So for Ito-san, as an author, how do you feel about your novels being adapted into films? Are there any worries that certain aspects of the work may be displayed in a way that you had not intended?
映像化に関してですよね。実は私は昔、イラストレーターをやっていたことがありまして、他の方の原作をシナリオにしたりしてたんですね。なので、映像化、たくさんの人間が関わる映像化の中で、原作がどうしてもこう変化していく。原作とは少しずつやっぱり違うものになっていくっていうプロセスは、私自身がシナリオライターとして経験してきたことなので、それはもう肯定しています。原作を原作のまま映画にするのなら、それはなんかもう原作を読んでればいいのかなと。いろんな人の頭が、考えが合わさり、加わり映画になっていくわけですので、他の人のイマジネーションやたくさんの思いが加わって、また別のものになった映画を楽しめばいいのかなというふうに考えています。お願いします。
So this is my perspective on this matter. I used to be an illustrator, and I used to adapt other people's works, original works, and make it into a different work. So I know what it's like to have a lot of people, a team of many people involved in the production, adapting an original work, and I know all about that process. And I was a script writer, a screenwriter, writer, so I am all for that kind of process, and I do understand that from an original work, as when you start adapting it, it will become obviously something different, something new. A lot of people are involved in it after all, and so if you want going to get as a result something that's become a visual work of art, work, and if it's exactly the same as an original, my original work, then you might as well just keep on reading just my original work. And so I do understand that it becomes something totally different.
Okay.
一つの新しい作品として楽しみたいなという気持ちです。
Yes, and so you should really enjoy the adapted work as something different, but for what it is.
Thank you. If I can maybe ask one more question, and this question is going to be for Jocelyn. This question comes from Jacob. For Jocelyn, was there a general methodology for your translation, or did you tend towards an eclectic approach? Also, what readership did you have in mind, and how did this influence you?
Okay. I'll start with the bottom half of that question.
Okay, sure.
Because I think it helps answer the first part.
Sure.
When I was approached to do the translation, we were always from the start considering this book to be like for general audiences. Like originally it's published as a young adult novel in Japan, but Counterpoint doesn't really publish young adult exclusively. And we really saw it, like Yuki and I really saw it as a book that speaks to everyone, no matter how old you are. Like we've all been that age, we've all experienced these things, similar things, and I think there's a universality to the text that speaks to a broad range of ages. So I was really mindful of the fact that this was going to be read by adults. I want this to be read by adults, but I also want it to be still capturing its original target audience of younger people. So there was a fine line that we were walking, and really considering that while I was doing the translation in terms of like vocabulary and, how do I want to like, don't get too weird with idiomatic stuff or whatever. I don't have a methodology outside of that kind of thing. I think like I tend to approach each text that I work on as its own translation in its own self. So I'm always thinking of like, who is publishing this? Who is it being published for? Who was it originally published for? What is the author of the source material? What kind of things do they normally write? What messages are they trying to communicate? So I'm really engaging with each text on its own, and then I kind of go from there. In terms of the nuts and bolts of it, I just sit down and type every day until it's finished. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but
No, I think that was a great answer. I would like to ask actually one more question. This is from Kayla, and it addresses both Eto and Jocelyn. What inspired you, Mori-san, to write about such a difficult topic? And Jocelyn, how did you translate the work while being sensitive about the topic? What was difficult about portraying the theme?
ごめんなさい、ちょっと質問お願いできますか？ちょっとはっきり聞き取れなかったので。
はい、森さんへの質問ですけれども、このように非常に難しい問題というかテーマに取り込もうと思ったその動機というのは何なのかを聞かせていただけますか？
カラフルに関してですか？
カラフルです。はい。
はい。そうですね。やっぱり日本で、ちょうど私がこれを書いた20年ぐらい前に、子供の自殺ですとか、少女の援助交際ですとか、非常にシリアスな問題として浮上していたので、それを 物語の力で何かできないかなというのは最初にありました。それも子供たちに向かってお説教するのではなく、本の世界で楽しんでもらいながら、でもその本を読み終わった時に、もう一回この世界で頑張ってみようかなって思ってもらえるような本が書けたらなというのが一番最初にありました。お願いします。
So, my first motivation for writing this book was just 20 years ago when I wrote Colorful. A lot of societal problems, social issues were emerging in Japan. For example, suicide among children, or compensating dating, and all kinds of very serious problems were emerging in Japan. And my motivation was, is there something that I can do through storytelling or writing a novel that could sort of help those young people? And I didn't mean to give them a lecture, or I didn't want to be sort of telling them what to do, but I just wanted them to have a world, the world of books could be somewhere that they could have a little bit of a reprieve or a bit of fun. And then after reading the book and immersing themselves in that world of books, maybe they would have a little bit more energy or a little bit more of a will to go back to the world that they live in every day, and to try a little bit to get back and live in that world. Give them a little bit of that sort of strength.
As for how I approached the difficult subject matter, fortunately, I had a source text that already did that for me. So, because Mori wrote so thoughtfully and so beautifully about these issues, and in such a like she says, with such a light touch, where you can go into this world and it's a really serious issue. There's a lot of serious issues that these people are facing, but the way Mori handled it is so skillfully balanced that I just basically did that. Like I just wrote those words in English and kind of was like, yay, I have such great source material to work with here. I mean, obviously I'm avoiding any kind of language that could be misconstrued it might mean one thing, like it might mean the same thing as the Japanese word, but if I translated it like that, it would have extra connotations that were not intended by Mori in her source materials. So I was always very mindful of extra connotations of words, because you definitely do not want to have any unintended meaning when you're writing about something so sensitive, with such a balance between the seriousness of the subject matter and the lightness of the humor and the text itself. So, I mean, for my part, it was mostly being very aware of what every single word I used meant, and every extra connotation and nuance that it might have, to make sure that I wasn't adding anything like to my translation, which isn't in the source text.
Yeah, I think that's really nicely put. You say that this is what you did, like you just took it, and but you should give yourself incredible credits for the flawless translation. So, all right, it is, I think, time for us to perhaps wrap things up. I would just like to thank everyone, if that's okay. So thank you, Eto Mori-san and Jocelyne Allen, for, again, insightful discussion and for answering everyone's questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. And a special thanks to Dr. Momokano Podolsky for her interpretation work, which is another form of translation interpretation, sort of similar. And also to Ayumi Takai and Nobi Nakamura, who are working behind the scenes. I hope everyone has a really great evening, and thank you so much.
Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Mori-san. Thank you, Mimi.
Thank
and
you
of
very
course,
much.
Momo.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much.